Tonight we have a newcomer, which is Dr. Harold Kudler, because Jerry Fromm, our usual consultant, was not able to make it today. He's somewhere in South Africa on a safari, so we weren't sure we would be able to connect with him. And Dr. Harold Kudler was so nice and accepted our invitation, and he joins us from Duke University. Dr. Kudler received his MD from Downstate Medical Center and trained in psychiatry at Yale, and he is an associate consulting professor at Duke and an adjunct professor at the Uniformed Services University of Health Sciences. From 2000 to 2005, he co-chaired the U.S. Department of Veterans Affairs Special Committee on PTSD, which reports directly to Congress. He has served on the International Society for Traumatic Stress Studies Board of Directors, and he is also co-led development of joint VA Department of Defense guidelines for the management of post-traumatic stress, etc. From 2000 to 2014, he was an associate director of the VA's Mid-Atlantic Mental Illness Research, Education, and Clinical Center on Deployment Mental Health. From 2006 to 2014, he co-led the North Carolina governor's focus on returning military members and their families. And in July 2014, he joined the VA Central Office in Washington, D.C. as chief consultant for the mental health services. Starting in May 2017, he served as acting assistant deputy under Secretary for Patient Care Services until his retirement from the VA in 2018. He's a distinguished life fellow of the American Psychiatric Association, and Dr. Kudler plays a leadership role in a number of mental health organizations, including the International Center for Multi-Generational Legacies of Trauma, and he's the current president of the Psychoanalytic Center of the Carolinas. So I imagine that's North and South Carolina, right? Okay. And we're very thankful, among many other things, to Françoise Davoine, who's been a steady consultant from the beginning to this series, for also thinking of Harold Kudler and for inviting him today. And since Françoise, I always only say she is an analyst from Paris, I just thought I'm gonna list some of the many books she wrote. She's the author of History Beyond Trauma, of Wittgenstein's Folly, of The Birth of the Political Self, Madness and the Social Link, and then most recently, a book on the pandemic, wars, traumas, and literature, and also her latest book on Jungian psychoanalysis. So I think with these three, we're in very good hands. And what I will do, but I will be briefer than last time, I will just give a short summary of the case that Oleg presented to us last time, because I do think it's important, since we're hearing so many cases, to have somewhat of a link between the cases. So the patient Oleg presented last time was a prisoner of war. He was taken captive by the Russians, and he was in captivity for quite a long time. He looked for treatment when he was finally released or found his home way back, and he saw Oleg for about 2.5 months. He was terribly tortured by the Russians. I'm not exactly sure I want to go into the detail, but it had a lot to do with him not being able to sit or stand after he was being tortured. And for instance, after he was tortured, he was also had to stand still for 10 hours. any move he made was punished by the Russian soldiers. He did allow his therapist to talk about the torture, and when he narrated what had happened to him, his therapist froze. He related to us that he became numb and felt like he was glued to his chair. He was not moving. And in a way, we were thinking that that mirrored a bit his still and frozen posture, the way that the patient had been tortured. Patient, he described, liked to be alone. And there was also some physical therapy recommended to him by the Primo Levi Center, which is the center in Paris that Beatrice works at, and that I think you trained with in Lviv. During his captivity, the patient was reading everything he was able to get his hands on, but in particular, he read Seneca, the letters to Lucilius. And somehow the two of them, Oleg and the patient, started a kind of spontaneous conversation to talk about Seneca. In a way, that's how they became to know each other. He recalled how he was sitting where he had been captured and thinking nobody was coming to liberate him. He thought that that was it. And he stared at nothing and he said goodbye to his life. And in that preparation for his death, he narrated to Oleg that time was slowing down. And I think it was only the books that he had with him that that kept him alive. But he was eventually liberated. And during his stay at the hospital in Lviv, he was encouraged to do some art therapy. And Oleg was generous enough to share 3 drawings of his with us, which were incredible. Again, I'm not going to share them tonight. But just to say that the first one was a very abstract, very red painting. The second one had the first words on them, with which about which we talked a lot afterwards, and the third one was a drawing that had a bit of a joke on it, and also had the sentence "This is not us" on it. At some point, Oleg, 3 weeks before, he decided that it was time for the patient to leave the hospital ground, because the hospital, and we had noticed this in other cases too, was beginning to feel like captivity to him. And so he thought it was important for this patient to leave and to have the sense of liberty and freedom. And it was then, when he was leaving the hospital for the first time, that he himself for the first time could develop also some violent thoughts against the people outside of the hospital, or one person in particular. So I won't say much more about the case, because Oleg also asked us to treat it confidentially, but I just want to summarize some of the questions that came up during the discussion. I think the first question that Françoise posed to him was that what he could say about his countertransference with such a tortured soul. And Oleg was reporting that his first impression of the patient was that he felt he was watched intensely by him, and that he in turn also watched him intensely. And so there was a kind of a freezing stare between them. And Françoise interpreted that was to be expected, because he had to know who this Oleg was. He had never met him before. So a question that always comes up in our discussion is, who is this person that I'm supposed to talk to and suddenly, trust and develop a relationship with? So very important for therapists to work with such traumatized people, to also reveal themselves a bit as a person and not just as a therapist. And in this case, it was, I think, the bond through Seneca that helped you be known to him as a person. Oleg told us also that the countertransference changed over time from being very reserved, tense, and careful to feeling more relief and trust in the relationship with the patient. They both shared a love for writing. They both shared a love for Seneca. And through these conversations, we thought that the patient was slowly discovering his humanity again. Oleg also observed that the patient's body was screaming silently in pain and was frozen in time. And to unfreeze gradually his body, Oleg used what he called exposure therapy, which we didn't know what it was. So he explained it to us, and he said that he had asked the patient, I guess after some time, if I understood this correctly, to go very slowly through the memory of the torture, moment by moment, opening himself up to the therapist. And he felt once he had opened himself up more and more to the therapist, it became a shared event between the two of them. He was no longer alone with the memories of the torture. And this was also, he felt very alone when he had seen the family whom he could not tell what had happened to him. And so that also helped him kind of digest to some extent what had happened to him and to begin to create an afterlife, a life after torture for him. At the end of the case presentation, there were some more questions and comments of what the patient had precisely read of Seneca, what had served him in Seneca, and how the stoicism he had read about also mirrored the stoicism he himself had shown as he was tortured by the Russians. And then the 3 drawings were also discussed in more detail, and we could also all observe a gradual movement in the drawings from very abstract to use a little bit of Lacan, from very abstract to an imaginary, and then slowly also adding and inserting himself in some symbolic. And the notion of us, of what the patient wrote on the drawing, opened up also a wide discussion about the many meanings of that statement. So that's the summary. I hope it matches, Oleg, what you remember from your own case presentation. And in any case, it is now us, it's not us, but it's now us, and particularly you, Oleg, who will present your second case. And I'm personally very grateful to you to do it. And I also want to thank again Oksana for doing a wonderful job in translating it into Ukrainian. Thank you.
I will add just one more sentence to your
Please.
wonderful summary. That what was also important in the end, that our patient joined the movement of support for former prisoners in order to protect their rights.
Yeah.
And this was also this parallel between Seneca, who was also in the government of a authoritarian state, and he tried to turn it into a state for the people. That was also important. Hello, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really glad to see you today, especially those who have contributed to our knowledge. Dr. Hoffman and Dr. Günther, who helped us to learn the unknown, the unspoken. Thank you for being here with us. And Dr. Marina Blufstein, who is joining us here today. I will be presenting a lady patient, a civilian, Svitlana, who is 59 and who comes from Kharkiv.
Peter?
And we'll be having 4 parts to this conversation. Just a moment.
Okay.
I'll try to put them up for you. The first part will be called by a quote from William Shakespeare from Macbeth. Oh, horror, horror. Horror, tongue not, nor heart cannot conceive nor name thee. And the second part will be also called with a quotation from the same work by Shakespeare. Give sorrow words. The grief that does not speak knits up the overwrought heart and bids it break.
Oksana,
Yes.
can I interrupt? We have a
Sure.
hard time. The volume for us is very low. Is there some way you can make it louder?
Yeah. How is that?
Unfortunately, not much better.
No,
No.
why not?
But it helps maybe if we turn on our volume.
Now that I heard very
Can
well.
Can
Was
you
this
hear
you,
me
Bernd?
now?
Yes, and I hear you very well. Thank you.
Did you?
Oh, you have to change the channel.
There is a little image of a globe.
Yeah, I see.
on the
Thank you.
screen, and then click English for the language.
Can-
Okay.
Great, thank you. Das ist toll, danke.
Can you hear me now?
Yes. Perfect.
Can you hear me like this?
Yes.
Okay, okay.
Danke.
I'm not hearing the translation. I'm just not here.
You cannot hear me?
Mrs. Lachman, are you hearing the English or are you hearing the Ukrainian?
I'm not hearing anything. It's too.
Oh,
So what you need to do is to go below, and that it's there is a sort of global button.
Yeah, well,
Yes.
now it does say English on the
Yeah, so
bottom.
Yeah.
push that.
Very good.
Push that
Oh.
button.
Okay, English. Yeah, it's
Yes.
checked off. But
how about now? Can you hear it?
can I hear what Ole is
The
saying? No.
translation.
The translation? No.
You
No.
heard
You
Oksana
heard
now,
her,
I
but
think.
you
Yeah.
heard Oksana now.
I heard it already.
I
You
think
heard
that
it.
was what you were looking for. Let's try and we'll
Yeah,
see if
let's
it now
try for
works.
Lachman. No,
1, 2,
let's.
3, 4, 5. Did you hear that?
And you might
Yeah.
just wait for a couple of seconds, because when it just starts, there is a little delay. Once that Berzuk starts, a few more seconds later, the translation will start.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Marina.
you.
Yes.
Yes, please.
Mhm. Okay, the first part of our presentation will be named by the quotation from Shakespeare's Macbeth. Oh, horror, 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 tongue no heart can conceive nor name thee. And the second part will be called Give Sorrow Words. The grief that does not speak knits up the overwrought heart and bids it break. The encounter of the horror in Saltivka and miraculous healing. And the third part will be called Meeting Oneself. And the fourth part, a tragedy of generations on the divide, on the border of the worlds of despotism and humanity. As I already said, Svetlana, 59, is an internally displaced person who used to live in Kharkiv. She's retired. She's living in Lviv now at her friend's house. And she was admitted to our hospital with a diagnosis that had to do with her adrenal gland failure. She also has sick kidneys. She's been sick for 18 years, so she has multiple physical diagnoses and chronic pancreatitis and cardiomyopathy. And she was referred to a psychiatrist because of her changes in her behavior and mental health. She kept staying in bed all the time, explaining that she could not stand on her feet. She didn't talk much. She was apathetic and she was lost in thought during the day, and she didn't speak to anyone about her thoughts. She complained of symptoms of physical malaise, of weakness in her legs, internal anxiety, trembling of her body, and sleep disturbances. She slept 3 to 4 hours a day. The psychiatrist, during her first consultation, who had no psychotherapeutic experience or education, examined the patient and prescribed 300 milligrams of gabapentin. And during the first weeks, her condition did not improve. She became even more anxious, and that her body was getting weaker and trembled more. During her second, I consulted her for the second time, and when I entered the ward, the patient was in bed. And it was carefully made. She was neat and wearing a laced pajamas. Her hair was neatly brushed, and she was made up. Her face was made up, and there were 4 more women in the ward, and she virtually did not communicate with them. And when I entered, she greeted me and expressed her desire to talk to me. And when I suggested that we go to a different room, at first she denied because she said she could not walk. But after I suggested we use the wheelchair, she agreed to try and walk to the other room on her own. And she used a little help from on my part to get out of bed, and she was walking slowly with my help to the next room. And I could visibly see, her limbs shaking, and she was talking to me while sitting in a chair. When I asked her what brought her to the hospital, she was telling me in detail about her 18th history of renal failure, which was caused by invalid treatment by hormones before that. Олег, почекай, Олег, почекай, ти чуєш мене? When she asked me how she came to our hospital, she told me she was trying to self-medicate and increased her hormonal therapy dose. So she increased her dose on her own to 16 and 36 milligrams a day, and she had to turn for treatment because of her headache and body shaking and elevated blood pressure. She kept emphasizing the adrenal problems, the past mistakes, and bodily sensations. And she totally avoided the circumstances of why she was in Lviv at all. When I asked her if she had any relatives next to her, she answered dryly that she used to have a husband who died before the war. And when I asked her where she was living, she also answered dryly that she was living in Kharkiv. And when I asked her when she had moved to Lviv, she answered it was last November. Her answers were very short and unemotional. And when I asked where exactly in Kharkiv she was living, she told me it was Saltivka. And when I remarked that Saltivka is the district that is being heavily shelled and bombed by the enemy, the patient unexpectedly changed in her face. She became angry, tense, and answered in Russian very abruptly. You have no right to ask me about this. I don't want to remember that. I will be feeling really bad. Stop. You have no right. And that was a quotation in Russian. I agreed that we were not going to talk about it at that moment, and I suggested two things. If you feel better while speaking Russian, you can tell me more about your experience. You're free to do it. And the second, I asked her to tell me about herself, what she did in her life, what was her profession. The patient agreed to that, and she told me that she graduated from a university and used to work at a kindergarten and at elementary school with children who needed inclusion form of education with special needs. She told me while being calm and interested, and I could tell that her condition changed, and she became much calmer. The trembling was virtually invisible, and she was showing interest in her face and smiling a little bit. And we talked for about an hour. And during this time, she didn't complain of fatigue at all. By the end of the conversation, I suggested the following, and quote, I want to turn to you not as a patient, but as a professional, a teacher. And after that, I told her briefly about neurobiology of mental trauma of the war. And she was very attentively listening to that. And after this short psychoeducation, I told her that next time we were going to go back to that story of Saltivka. And then we had a 10-minute EMDR session, a short protocol. And the patient gave the following feedback that her bodily tension and trembling decreased sufficiently. Also, she was prescribed with fluoxetine, 0.5 milligram twice a day. After the end of the session, the patient unexpectedly stood up and without any support, slowly went towards her ward. During the session, the patient, for about 2/3 of the time, she spoke Russian to me after we discussed the language issue. And when I was looking after her, I felt calm. But then I had this thought that she was not Russian. She was not Russian or Ukrainian, neither Russian, Ukrainian. The second session was the following day. The patient came to the room on her own. And from the very start, she started telling me her story with her adrenal glands, about her tremor, about her headaches. And when I asked her about how she slept last night or the night before, she said that for the first time she had slept the whole night. And when I remarked that I was glad that she could walk quite fine on her own, she smiled and said that she had not expected it of herself. And she also unexpectedly noticed that. This allowed me to mention neurobiological basis of trauma and go back to her memories about Saltivka and Kharkiv. With this good cognitive and emotional relationship that we were establishing, I asked her to describe the worst episode she didn't want to think about. And this is this episode. Here it is. Late April 2022. Constant bombing of Saltivka. The patient and her neighbor are living in their cellars most of the time. On that day, she did not remember the exact day of the week and date. There was a heavy shelling, missiles land and bombs landing closer and closer to their multi-story building house. She was seized by terror, and this terror suddenly made them run away from the cellar and run towards the forest. Shells were exploding around them. She can't remember for how long they had been running until they reached a pile of fallen trees, and they hid beneath them. And they lay there for who knows how long, and then it got dark and cold and quiet. They were afraid to go back home. They started walking to find the city or a village. And then she noticed that her right leg was hurting. And when she lifted her pants, she saw a bleeding wound. They reached a village and they met the Ukrainian army patrol. They took them to a hospital in Poltava region. And that's where her wound was treated. And there was a shrapnel in the wound. And they spent 4 weeks in that hospital. After that, they went back to Saltivka again. The patient was tense, but I asked her to repeat this story again from the start of the shelling until she got to the hospital. The patient agreed to do that. And we repeated this story 4 times on that day. With each time, the patient started describing it faster and in a more condensed way. But in the last version of the story, there appeared memories about sisters, the patient's sisters, who live in Kazakhstan and in Germany. We finished the session also with a short EMDR protocol. And the patient also noted a substantial decrease of tension in her body. And I have to say, she really liked EMDR. The next day, the patient came to the session on her own in a good mood, and she didn't complain of any bodily problems at all. I suggested, I asked her to tell me about her family and her childhood. And it turned out she was born in Kazakhstan. Her grandmother was of Polish ethnicity, and her grandfather was Czech. Before World War II, they came to Donbass to earn money. But they were deported to Kazakhstan as dangerous and unreliable, well, quote unquote. Her mother grew up there, and the patient herself was born there. That's where she grew up, and that's where she married for the first time. She had a son, and this is where the son emerges in our story. And she and her husband decided to go back to Ukraine, to Donbass and to Kharkiv region. In Ukraine, she divorced her husband, met another man, married him, and they had a good life, but he died of cancer before the full-scale invasion started. During our conversation, a nurse entered the room to get some stuff of hers. The patient, after the nurse left, stopped her conversation and said, "This nurse didn't want to talk to me because I spoke Russian. She complained to me like a little girl." I answered, "It's not about you. She didn't know you were not Russian." And language for her is a sign of the people who may be a threat to her husband or son or her daughter or her friends or relatives. The patient thought a bit and said, "Yes, I never thought about that." Right after this sentence, the patient starts telling me about her son, the son who is a doctor and who lives in Donetsk, who in 2014 did not leave Donetsk because he didn't want to leave his job. Right now, she's really worried about him because after a certain period of time, Donetsk administration, the occupation administration, would not let any men leave the region. His children and his wife are also there. And the patient starts crying. And we also ended the session with a short EMDR protocol. And the patient noted that the tension in her neck, in her eyes and chest was alleviating, and she had never described that before in such detail. In between sessions, I start noticing that the patient goes down to the hospital lobby, spends time in the cafeteria and talks to people outside. The last session, we forgot, we didn't mention the body at all. And the session started with a question from the patient. What do I do? Do I stay in Lviv Do I go back to Kharkiv? Do I go to my sisters in Germany, or do I go to my sisters in Kazakhstan? Because I don't really want to stay in Lviv because I have no place to live, and going back to Kharkiv is dangerous. I don't want to go to my sisters in Germany, but I want to go to Kazakhstan because that's where her childhood and her memories are, and her sister, whom she loves very much. I suggested that she stayed in Lviv and go on rehabilitation in a resort, and then find a right solution for herself after talking to her relatives. For another few days, I saw the patient walking in the lobby of the hospital, talking to patients, taking walks in the yard. In a few days, I received a text. I will read it to you. A text in Russian. Doctor, I'm on my way to the resort. 3 dots. Thank you very much for helping me. 3 dots. I'm really grateful to you. I will always remember you. This is not just the patient who had a physical and mental trauma. Her life is an illustration of transgenerational trauma, trauma of the generations, from her Polish grandmother and Czech grandfather who had been deported as unreliable to Kazakhstan by a Russian chauvinist power. A story of a mother who was born in captivity, going back to Ukraine, and again, the trauma of war and loss of freedom. And this story of mothers and generations of sons who were lost on the border of civilizations of despotism and humanity. Civilization that is divided by the Siversky Donets River. On Siversky Donets, one of the most famous artists, realistic artists of the 20th century, Ilya Repin, who was until recently believed to be a Russian artist. And Ilya Repin drew this border of the world in his painting. This is Tsar Ivan killing his son. And this is the Ukrainian part of his legacy and of his background, democracy. Cossacks writing a letter to Turkish Sultan and Ukrainian Hopak Patans. The last painting of his life was stolen and hidden, and it was not known until recently. And I would like to finish my today's presentation, and I would like, I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Have you ended, Oleg, or you still would like to say something? Well, an unbelievable presentation again. Thank you.
for me personally, I've been since the beginning of the war very interested in this whole debate about the language and which language to speak and what it means for Ukrainians to speak in the language of the enemy. And we've had some of that in one of the other cases, but we haven't heard the side of it, her speaking in Russian, but not really being Russian, but being mistaken for one. So of the many things you were describing, it's a very, very moving history and story. Since I'm a traditionalist, I will start again asking Françoise for her first impressions, and then I will ask Dr. Kudler. Or
I have
Harold.
just a comment and 2 questions. The comment is about how, like the last time, you go right away to the positive appreciation of the person. You speak to her not as a victim, but as a teacher. What she's, and this opens up. And also you discuss with her the neurobiology of trauma, like partner, you know, it's equal. And this positive aspect is very, very important. There was a anthropologist called Rivers who was drafted during First World War and with very, very traumatized officers in England, in Scotland. And he said at the end of an article that he pronounced and wrote in the Lancet in 1917 and published in 1919, that instead of pushing people to regression, he always think about asking them something which is as dissociated as the rest, some positive detail. He speaks about us, I just expand a little, a soldier who was officer, who was very, very making a lot of efforts, but every night his body, who had exploded by him, was coming, the face was coming near, near, near. And he wanted to suicide. And she said to him, we go back to the hole. And he said, now tell me a little positive thing which happened in this horror. And the guy said, well, I took his buckle, his belt.
Belt buckle.
Yes,
Yeah.
his military thing, and I sent them to his mother. He had completely forgotten that. And the anthropologist, who was, by the way, specialist of the funeral rites among headhunters in the Pacific, told him, you have performed a ritual, funeral ritual. And the nightmares disappeared. So you do the same, I think, when you address her directly as her profession. And second, when you have no suspicion about her speaking Russian. As you say, immediately you think that she's not from Ukraine, she's from somewhere. So she can start. So my question that I have two, what kind of neurological issues did you share with her about trauma? Is it Bessel van der Kolk? That you said it was a Bible for you last time? For me too. And the body keeps the score. And the second, because of the my French accent, I did not understand very well about the last pictures you show. I did not understand very well who was that guy. Okay.
Yeah, it's very complicated, the last one. It's impossible to say in a few moments. It's need another probably 1.5 hours to explain. Але повертаючись до того першого
But
запитання.
going back to your first question about neurobiology, I was approaching, I was using a twofold approach. First, I was using my approach as a Adlerian analyst, because occupation is a big part of fresh experience that we can remember a lot of rational things besides unconscious things. And the second part was a neurobiological part. We have to appeal to prefrontal lobes, and prefrontal lobes, we can only engage it when we rationally remember things we learned how to do. So through the university and her job, we arrived at her prefrontal lobes. And then I explained it really simply in 2 sentences. The trauma really arouses the amygdala, which starts working and then after the trauma time is over, it still keeps sending signals about the problems. But when you turn the prefrontal lobes on, you can try and calm down this amygdala.
Okay.
And this is what she was able to understand. On the one hand, it was a direct intervention, and on the other hand, it was an appeal to certain structural things of her brain. And the last thing was that I was really impressed by her hiding her son from me during 3 sessions. She avoided talking about her children. At first, I thought she had none. And so I was really careful about this because I didn't want to traumatize her more. But then she just made some slips of a tongue about her first husband and her children with her first husband. And I ventured to talk a little bit about her son, but that was in the process, after we remembered that the nurse reacted to the danger to her, possibly her son or her daughter or her relatives. And that's where this tragic story of her son came up, a son who serves the occupiers, and who is a doctor there. We hope he is still a doctor, and he cannot leave that place with his family. This is the generation, the 4th generation already started from her great grandparents who are lost in between civilizations on this authoritarian side, on the tyranny side. And this is where quote unquote Russian artist who came from Cossacks, an artist Ilya Repin, who was believed to be Russian, and unconsciously, if you read his book, The Far Close, he was not a philosopher or a historian, he was a painter. But he described this tyrannical imperial part of Russia, and the part that was suffering from him, the Ukrainian humanity. And this is the border drawn between them in his paintings, where he was lost. But she does believe that maybe he will be able to leave that part, the occupied part of the country, but this is not going to be simple.
Thank you. And I thank you very much to mention the transgenerational transmission, because it's also a transmission of resources. It's not only the transmission of trauma, and also to cite Shakespeare and literature, because that our job is performed since antiquity through those authors.
I will also tell you why by the end of this first session, I thought she was neither Russian nor Ukrainian. You remember how I described her in great detail. She had this characteristic pajamas with a lot of laces.
Yes.
And it looked really Central European to me. This is how Czechs and Polish people were dressing. It was the kind of style, not a simple style, her style, because so far away from home, she still kept that style. It was not something she invented. It was this different kind of refined, and this is how it occurred to me, and probably not incidentally.
You are very acute on history of clothes too, not only. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Harold Kudler.
Yes, thank you. So many things to think about. But again, my associations begin with Shakespeare. That quote from Macbeth, which I think is a play about psychological trauma, first and foremost, is when Macduff discovers the body of the king who's been murdered in his bed. And it's not just that the king as a person has been murdered, the nation has been thrown into disarray. This is a disaster at every level. And it reminds me of how Macduff responds when he learns later that his wife and children have been murdered at Macbeth's order. And Macduff, when he hears the news, goes into a dissociated state. He keeps saying, "What? All my chicks? All?" And he asks it 2 or 3 times. And the prince who tells him this tries to shake him out of it. And he says, "Listen, this is bad news, but you have to dispute it like a man." That's what he says. Deal with it like a man. You can't just stand there in shock. And to which Macduff responds, "I will, but first I must feel it like a man." And I think your patient, when you first meet her, is incapable of feeling her own story, her own feelings, she's incapable of containing her own history. And she has isolated it, everything related to it, into her body, which is now totally non-functional. And this brings me to the work of Henry Crystal. 17 years old, Crystal was in a concentration camp at Sachsenhausen. Later, he migrates to the United States and he goes to medical school. He becomes a psychiatrist and psychoanalyst. And he's asked by the German government to try to study why is it the Jewish survivors of concentration camp in the area where he's living near Detroit, Michigan, why aren't they taking our money? We offer them money as reparation, and they won't take the money. And he hasn't been thinking about his own experience as a concentration camp survivor, but he agrees to go and interview these survivors. And he says, they look like they're doing pretty well in life. They have houses, they have businesses, they have children. They look like they're doing well. But inside, they function, his term was like empty husks, like empty shells. There's no life inside. And he develops this idea of alexithymia. And in shorthand, the way I understand that is that, Freud writes about signal anxiety, and that when we approach a situation that's dangerous, that raises tension or conflict, we don't even have to be conscious of the anxiety, just a little like a doorbell ringing. Defense comes and answers the door and protects the house. But trauma overwhelms the capacity to use affects, even memory, feelings, as signals. and you end up with no feelings, alexithymic, no words for your feelings. You're disconnected. So as I hear this story, I think about a woman who is so overwhelmed by, as you say, the intergenerational meaning, the actual traumatic event, the fear for her children and her grandchildren, the fact that she's been thrown into the same whirlwind as her parents were once, no home, no place to go, a wanderer, that she can't contain this except to project it onto her body. And we can talk about neurophysiology. My first writings on PTSD were neurophysiological, but and there's no question there's neurophysiology and there's a brain and there are adrenal glands. But I think what you did for her was first help her locate there was something going on, and then slowly help her discover what it was that was going on in a progressive way that she could tolerate, and through your support as her therapist. And that's very powerful. Those are my thoughts.
Mm-hmm.
I'd like to say something. When I was talking to her about neurophysiology of trauma, I also included her problems with adrenal glands because they play a major part in production of stress hormones. And it's really important that it was the adrenal failure that she was having. Her body didn't have any resource to respond to this either. And somehow she heard this, and it was clear to her because these were her words, because she had been talking about adrenal glands to everyone, and that's all she had been talking about. And it was an important metaphor. They were a metaphor of her incompetence, which she kept appealing to.
Was it a metaphor or just, I wonder if it's just a language that you could take from her and use it and trust that word instead of saying, oh, she's boring with her repetition, and use it in a language game. Perhaps not so metaphorical. That's what I was wondering.
Her reality became a metaphor. And for me, it was a really good way through her cognition to her emotions. And really, I use real life situations in patients' lives as metaphors. I say, just let's look at this metaphorically. And this is when there is a splitting between themselves and the metaphor.
What do you mean by a splitting between themselves and the metaphor?
Adrenal deficits is a real problem for this patient. That's her body, her organs, and her adrenal failure. But in our conversation, it becomes a metaphor of incompetence and incapability to respond to stress.
She was neurasthenic in the old language, right? She had weakness of her nervous, and in this case, her adrenal system. But metaphor too, because it exists on multiple levels, mental and physical, central nervous system, peripheral, hormonal circulation of stress hormones. It is a true mind-brain metaphor, and she has to struggle at all levels.
Let me interject something, and then Zoyana and Bernd. It reminded me, because it seems to me, Oleg, that the breakthrough came when you addressed her as Françoise said, in her role as a teacher, as somebody who knew something about neurology and physiology. It seems like that's when you made the first move in, let's say, into her. And it reminded me of something that it then became the explanation about the physical symptoms of her body. It's almost as if the science became a map. And Françoise, in her latest book on Jeanne psychoanalysis, speaks about, I think it's Tristan himself, who after he was wounded in the war and dissociated, how to connect him first back to a world was not through anatomy or physiology or neurology, but through a map to sort of locate himself in a kind of scientific field or scientific map that gave her a sense of, began to give her a sense again of her being a human being. I don't know, Françoise, if you agree with that. The American map, you know, to the physiology that the patient talks about, so where she can sort of see, you know, what organ was suffering.
Yeah.
I think that the first spike in our relationship came a little earlier when we managed to, when we were successful in managing her aggression. When I mentioned Saltuka, when she was saying stop it in Russian. And I said, okay, but you can speak Russian.
Mm-hmm.
And for her, it was unexpected.
Mm-hmm.
And the aggression was okay, like someone heard what she was saying. And on the other hand, there was no punishment for being so harsh and speaking Russian. And this was where trust was born. And then her occupation added to that trust, and we started moving on, because this moment of aggression for me and countertransference was the hardest part. I actually was taken aback and I held my breath. It was this unexpected aggressive sincerity, because you do expect these patients to be aggressive, but this is how we managed to.
Okay, let me go to Zoyana. Hi.
Thank you, Oleg. I would like to ask you, because I must have missed it. After you said, okay, you're free to speak Russian to me. And by the end of this, of your sessions with the patient, did she speak Russian? I did mention that about 2/3 was in Russian, 1/3 was in Ukrainian, but when she approached something really emotionally intense, she switched to Russian because that was her mother tongue. But overall, formally, she would speak Ukrainian to me as to the rest of the people. I had a fantasy when you said that he was a doctor. So this mother of this son really had to have been sick for a really long time. This was her way of calling for help and meeting her son as a doctor. I was also thinking about the identity disorders that we have a lot in our therapy when the trauma damages the self structure. It seemed like you were picking up the pieces of herself and bringing them together so she can feel her own integrity. I'm going to this resort. Thank you, doctor. I agree with that, but I don't think I was picking up the pieces of her and putting them together. I think she was doing it by herself, and I was just creating the circumstances where these healthy parts had to reintegrate. Because she did not seem helpless to me. looking for this space to put all these parts of identity back together, because as for me, the sense and the meaning is not our identity. It was born from self-identity. Thank you.
Thank you, Zoriana. Bernd, even though he's known to you as
Okay.
Kurt Günther.
Okay,
Go.
okay.
Go ahead.
Thank you. First of all, Oleg, thank you very, very much for the Shakespeare lines. Yeah, really, because the important thing is it also underlines the importance of nonverbal communication and to work with it when necessary. And I think that's what you did, because she is incapable of consciously experience her feelings, but the unconscious communication made you feel her experience and made you work with her feelings because you felt them. And this was, I think, very important. And then one thing, because of the language, I remember when we did the trainings in the Ukraine long before the war, I think 20 years ago, and in my group, yeah, you probably knew it, but I didn't know it because of the interpreter. I didn't know who spoke English, who spoke Russian, or who spoke Ukrainian. And at that time, it looked like as if it didn't matter. But now I really think I'm sure it mattered, but I couldn't work with it. Okay, thank you very much, Oleg.
Beatrice.
Thank you.
You have to unmute yourself. Du musst dich aus
Mikrofon
ja,
einschalten.
jetzt geht's.
Yes.
Okay.
Hey, so glad to meet you all here. Ole, I had a question, or several questions. First of all, thank you very much for this really elaborate presentation. I was interested in basically the shifts in the transference and the countertransference, because it seemed to me that from the very beginning, I mean, you said the first spike occurred when you felt you were able to address her aggression. But it seemed to me that from the very beginning, you entered her room and you went to where she was, not only literally, really, but symbolically speaking as well. And you addressed her, as many people said before, as a subject, as a human, as a person with a history, and not only as a victim. And I think you also addressed her as someone who was capable to walk and to stand out from her bed and come with you in the next room. To me, that was already the first interpretation, let's say, because you did not take for granted. I mean, you basically interpreted her not walking in a way as a hysterical symptom from a woman who, you know, is showing you through her body that, yes, there is a problem of not being able to move, but you invited her and helped her physically, and of course also through your own transference, or if you wish, counter-transference, to assume that she's very well able to get up from this place where she thinks she is stuck and move to the next room. To me, that was already the gesture, both verbal and unconscious and also physical, where you invited her, okay, let's go and move from this place where you think you're stuck. So that, I think, is the first thing I wanted to say as incredibly important, the way you addressed her from the very beginning. And she responded too. I think that what was striking to me, that the lace nightgown, well, you described that as, you know, showing her Eastern European origins, but it's also, you said she was made up. She wore makeup. And, you know, she presented herself as a woman with her libidinal life, that there seemed to be something intact too, so that you captured that, I think, whether consciously or unconsciously, and you worked with that throughout the whole series of sessions that you described to us. And I think that, you know, the fact that her first husband, her sons, her second husband, and so that concerns her libidinal life, her love life, which I think you also knew that was present from the very beginning. I think a very important moment. Yeah. Yeah. Interesting. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes. But I think it's very significant that a patient, quote unquote, in the hospital would dress in this way and wear makeup. It's, I mean, from the patients I saw, especially in your hospital, it's a rather rare occasion. I didn't see that any one of the patients were doing that. So the second question I had, in terms of the moves of the transference, countertransference, because obviously you always injected that at the end of the sessions, then you did a EMDR session with her, or at that particular moment, you acted as a psychoeducator. You know, you moved through very different positions that were as a psychiatrist, as an analyst, as a EMDR, a more cognitive behavioral therapist. Was this all kind of intuitively that you followed the intuition of the moment or the dynamic of what was happening in the session, or did you pre-think this sort of?
It's a kind of combination. We are developing here a protocol, a protocol for PTSD patients, but every patient has a different PTSD clinical scene, and you have to understand, you have to feel in it, and you have to know, and you can use all these moments that you, for example, I apply my knowledge in psychoeducation when I understood that she could take it, and I said, I'm talking to you as a pedagogue, it's immediately to the prefrontal, prefrontal cortex, and at the end, I'm very often, when I'm using some exposition, I'm using EMDR because it's allow us to take a napruga, tension, to take attention and to fix the positive thinking that's happening during the exposition. And she was very tense during the expositional period, and she really good responded to the EMDR, which make me powerful, because I made something good for her. And she would be more open next time and would be more interested to come and to share their not easy. As for my understanding, the most painful memories that she revealed in our therapy, it's a memory about son. It was not a memory about, Saltika. It was very traumatic. But son, he is trapped in the bus on the enemy's territory. It was very not easy to tell this to the people who are against Russians. This is a very, very scary to say. This my son is working in Donetsk, and it's kind of it's a fear for his life, for his threats, for his captivity, and for nebezpeka, insecurity to tell this to anybody on the Ukrainian territory.
Well, that's a situation where she is powerless. And you too.
That's why, but I see the resource her in her family, but I just allowed, was my design to stay her in the recreational sanatorium because we have such a possibility. for her to a little bit live through all of this that she was showed to in the therapy, and to talk to the sister in Kazakhstan and the sister in Germany, to be more involved in the family, because this is her resource for sure.
I have a last question. What do you think happened 18 years ago?
You know, I don't know.
Why?
I
You
don't know.
don't-
I have no time to. I keep myself very. You know. I have no time and efforts to go so deep in this very dramatic situation, and many patients that we have 10 patients per day.
Yeah.
I had this courage to go there, but I didn't spend much time on the first husband, second husband. It was not the focus.
Okay. Thank
Probably
you.
she will be back some days.
She will be back. Yeah.
I don't know. This probably
For psychoanalysis, perhaps. Yeah.
All right, thanks, Beatrice. Oleksandr, you're next. You have to unmute you, yeah.
Thank you very much for this opportunity to say a few words. Olek's case is also really interesting to me, and it's not the first time when I feel like saying that, when I feel like sharing the experience that has been accumulating with every new patient of ours. I'll be brief. I'm still here at the clinic, and today we were discussing another patient who came to us, who was referred from the center where Olek works, in order to keep her in inpatient setting. This is a patient who lost her son, and it's not quite clear whether he is dead or alive, and she still is living in hope that he is alive, but it's not it's 100% true. And the problem of our clinic with this patient was that she was in inpatient department, and she said she wanted to be here, but I want to be here, but things you're doing here are not helping. Just don't be in my way. I just want to stay here in the hospital. Just don't bother me. And I will connect this case to what Olek was saying. We're thinking about a really simple thing, which is part and parcel of analytic understanding. And I just understood how important it was. The psychoanalytical idea of a setting is that in many, with many patients here, we use the concept of a protected transitional space. And this setting, this is a setting of its own. And the patient that is here at the clinic, we told her, you know what, we will not bother you, just stay here. But what we're going to help to do is to help you find out what happened to your son, and then you can leave. What Olek said, it mirrored in this language problem, where we have a lot of cases of people coming from the East. There's this language issue, and they speak Russian or Ukrainian and switch between languages. And the things Olek was saying is a finding for me, because I thought that Olek, the way he spoke with her and the way he set it up, he created a really safe transitional space where she could switch from Russian to Ukrainian. And Russian language is a trauma language. Ukrainian language for her was a language of people who were helping her. And this is not the first time. I'm just sharing my internal experience to say that basically this safe transitional space, the setting is very well built, analytical. I perceive it as analytical setting where the patients can feel and where they combine their traumatic experience with non-traumatic experience in one space, and unite this experience with the help of any therapeutical means and try to work on it. And in Olek's case, this manifested pretty well because she was switching between languages. And when she switched to Russian, her trauma opened up. As soon as she used the language of the trauma, it opened up. And this is what we encounter everywhere. At first, we didn't think of it like this. We thought it was a usual cultural problem, this division into Ukrainian speaking and Russian speaking people. But this language issue now is just becoming really important because, again, Russian language is a language related to trauma, and Ukrainian language, at least here in Lviv, but in Kyiv and in other cities in Dnipro, it's a language which we use when we want to help. And this is where traumatic and non-traumatic experience come together in this safe space. And when we meet next time, I may present that case with my patient again, but I would like to thank Olek and stress again that this language issue is not that mundane as we thought of it. And I named the fourth part of my presentation, meeting oneself. And I would like to remind you, this happened after this nurse entered. And when she complained that she didn't want to speak to her because she spoke Russian. And I interpreted that this childish wariness, she didn't know you were Russian, and the language is a sign of a threat, exactly. And this is where she starts thinking on that. And she had this really calm and deep gaze, and she said, I have never thought about it this way. So she thought about herself as of someone who speaks the language of she's not, her Russian language is not a threat. It's just because that's her mother tongue and the way she is, that's how she encountered herself. Yeah, but you gave her this opportunity to speak of trauma in Russian, and that's what she did. It was a really important moment, and this what allowed her to go to the most painful thing, to her son.
May I remind you, the ones who've been here throughout the cases, we had one, it's not completely related, but it is one of those language moments which really stuck with me. We had one case presentation with Yuri a few months ago who talked about a woman refugee who was hiding, like your patient, in the basements, cellars of bombed out houses in Kherson, and she was hiding there for about 9 months. And at one point, after one of the Russian attacks, there was a Ukrainian soldier, I mean, seemingly Ukrainian soldier, coming into the cellar saying in Ukrainian, "It's fine now, you're safe, you can leave." And she realized somehow that that wasn't the case, that this was a soldier who had been kept, who had gone over to the Russians, or who, and so it was as a way to sort of lure her out and give her a sense of safety by speaking in her language, when in fact he was Russian. So we have all sorts of, I think, unbelievable examples of
language as safety, language as a way to betray, language as a way to make yourself be at home, but also maybe being, as your case, being seen as a traitor, as an enemy, when in fact this was not her first language. But anyway, Marina Blufstein, please.
Thank you, Олег. First of all, дуже дякую за таку чудову презентацію. Yeah, дуже дякую. And I just wanted to say,
Very much.
Okay, switching, just here. So it's interesting. I just wanted to share, I don't have questions, but I wanted to share my feelings as I was following your presentation and the discussion that has taken place right after that. I've heard a lot of the word wondering. I think, Harold, you were the one who also stressed that, the wonderment and wondering. And my impression of the discussion of how you work with this woman was that you've helped to transform, if we can use that word, wonderment into the journey. Wandering is aimless and goalless, if we can say that way. Journey does have a destination. It's still a movement. She has 3 generations of before her who were wandering. There are going to be many more generations after her who are also going to be wandering. There is no light switch that you can turn it on and off. And there will be wonderment with culture and wonderment with language. It's probably not the first and not the last time. Wonderment in so many other ways. But as long as she is on a journey and you joined her, and I think I felt very strongly that you helped her with this sense of a journey, the movement that is purposeful and goal-directed, whatever next wonderment is going to happen in her life, in her son's life, in her grandchildren, great-grandchildren's life, isn't going to be as traumatic, as impairing as it has been now. I just wanted to share my reaction to your presentation. And again, дуже дякую.
Françoise, I saw you wanted to say something.
Yes, everybody I heard is wonderful, Beatrice and Harold and you, and but I would insist on not a detail, a moment that was already there last time with the soldier, the attack against you, the ruthless attack that you manage to overcome, you know, improvisation. You don't think about it. You have to. So this is for me the analytical moment. Always with extreme trauma, we encounter a moment when we represent the ruthless agency which put them down, which annihilated them. They have to face it, and we are it. And I don't like those moments. I always try to avoid them. It happens. And at each time, we have to, what you invented is to say, okay, the Russian language will not be a matter of war between us. It will not be, I will not have a fanatical point of view about that. So you accept first that you have hit, but you manage to get out of that place. And Oleksandr spoke about the transitional space, and so you create it at that moment by saying, okay, you saw that she was not from there. And the journey, the wandering becoming a journey, and the walking, as Beatrice said, and that came after that big shock. When Shakespeare describes, you know, when Magda says, I don't react as first I have to retrieve what has been dissociated for some moment, because she can face you. Thank you. It's wonderful.
Можна ще два слова?
I agree with you. Yeah, можна я відповім? I agree about this, you know, because not in my feeling, in my attitude to the patient, I have been in such an aggressive position because as a Beatrice noticed it very well, and now I start to remember it. I came to the room and I saw the patients and I saw the potential patient that has this potential, and I said, give me a hand and let's go out of this. No, it was kind of aggressive, not aggressive by the behavioral, but aggressive by approach. And this was not very convenient situation to the patient in regression. Yeah, because you are pushing them. So far, I am a little bit not too old to be such a risky. But and also we must be quick in our intervention because we have many patients. That's the point. But very cautious on the other hand. You know, you have to feel it and know it, not only feel it.
With Harold, we spoke about the Salmon principle, and the second one is immediacy. React quick.
And the positive expectation.
Improvise,
I
right?
think
Improvise.
It's what you said, Françoise, you know, the ruthlessness, the ruthlessness that we have to be able to take on and feel at ease with. And I think that's the beginning moment that you already carry into the room, that you have on the one hand the ability to go to the place where she is psychically, but at the same time you are also somewhere else already, because you are already in this other room. And I think that also, you know, implies that you are willing to take on this identification at some point of being the aggressor. And I think, as you said, Françoise, you know, I think these are the most uncomfortable moments when we are identified, let's say, with the torturer in other cases.
I was Mengele someday.
Yeah, you know, those are the Mengele moments you've said. You've talked about. Yes. We have little time left, so there's two words. Okay.
I would like to say another thing. I forgot. The interesting thing is that the climax of this therapy was a solution to find a place that will be the safest for the patient. And she said, Germany, no. Lviv, no. Well, maybe Kazakhstan. I will go to where I spent my childhood, where I grew up, and where she felt relatively safe. So this again is about a safe and protected transitional space. So the search for this safe space was the climax of the therapy.
Okay. Doug Söderström, please.
Yes, thank you, and thank you very much. I think we all admire what we have heard and what you're doing as 10 hours a day, Oleg. And I just had a comment about the loyalty. But first, I will say that you are very near psychosis when she comes and says, you have no rights to ask me. And I was thinking about all the patients that will not have the luck to meet you and will get a lot of medication. And then there is so much problem when you see these situations, well, 5 or 10 years afterwards. And it's so important that she could meet you at that time. And you said, yes, I'm not going to ask you, but in fact, you asked her about her memories just minutes after that. And I think, well, it's really, as Françoise said, a psychoanalytical moment. I was thinking about the transgenerational trauma and how it can or not go to the grandchildren. And I was thinking about what you said, the last words to her, you said, well, you're going to talk within your family about the future. I think it's very good way to not to say that this you have to do for the future, or to become judgmental about what is happening or what she's doing or not with the son and the grandchildren. I think to leave it to this goes back to the family history. And I admired really also that part that you leave it to family history, but the time has started again for her. The time has not stopped. It is thanks to you. She's not in this body moment where time has stopped and she didn't know where to go. She is on her way, and I think, well, it's really beautiful. Thank you.
I agree with you. Oleg, yes?
I just would like to say about this. I was thinking a lot about transgenerational trauma for many years, yeah, unconsciously and consciously, and because I am also a part of this transgenerational trauma now, yeah, and it could be few results of this, yeah. The family through this trauma can find a very efficient approach to solve it, or to preserve it, or to vegetate.
Survive.
Vegetate.
Survive.
Survived, yeah, it's a survival instrument. And also the trauma can be repeated. And the sadness of this story, that the son of this patient repeated the trauma. He decided not to leave Donetsk in 2014. Yeah, for such a reason. I don't know what kind of reason, but we just repeated the trauma. And this is a very important, and probably the sadness as my counter-transferent, that he was not able to say, no, I will not stay with them anymore. I will not repeat it.
2014 was the period where they could leave?
Yeah.
Okay.
They could leave 14, 15, 16, 17. Now they cannot leave. Yeah. And I don't know what's the reason, but it was the kind of, in my opinion, a traumatic event not to get rid of this compulsion.
Yes, but you took the sadness into yourself, and you didn't become judgmental about what was going on. And well, that's a good analytic work, I think.
Too many years of mistakes. Yeah. And good teacher, Kurt Günther was of my analytical teacher. Very tough. And
well, we slowly have to come to an end, unfortunately. Is there still something, Françoise and Harold, you want to say before we have to say goodbye? Any last words?
Well, go on, Harold. Go for it.
Yeah.
Well, they give you the last word then, Françoise. I'll say that over the years, I've learned a great deal from Françoise about the link between trauma and psychosis. And for you biologists, both are consistent with hypofrontality and functional neuroimaging, PTSD, and say schizophrenia. The frontal lobes are less active, although what that means is an interesting question. But in both trauma and psychosis, there's an inability to organize one's experience, a sense of losing boundaries, and frankly, losing oneself, becoming a wanderer. in your own life, within time, within context of all sorts, a refugee. And I think in this case, the patient was losing her mind and the function of her body. And in fact, I think losing her mind within her body. Her mind was floating in her body, doing strange things. And I think what Oleg helped her do was reestablish the boundary between mind and body, at first in an educational way, and then through EMDR, a sense of mastery over her states, her body states, which then led to her mind and her body relaxing and opening up capacity, and ultimately functioning again, and functioning with boundaries. And it's a powerful demonstration of what psychotherapy can do, frankly, regardless of how we conceptualize what we're doing. The patient takes what they can from us and puts it to good use. And this was a good example of that. So I'll stop there.
Françoise?
Yes, yesterday evening in Paris at 5 o'clock, a huge explosion was heard near my home here.
Val de Grace, yeah.
The hospital, military hospital, 17th century military hospital called Val de Grace. And a huge building, not the chapel, but a huge 17 crumbled. Okay. But I thought that it's an experience that you have every day and several times a day. And I was thinking, I always, when we leave each time, I am thinking about, that we cannot, yes, I can imagine. You work under condition of wars. It's not only the patients. Psychoanalysis under the conditions of war is you. And they know that. They know that you are in a proximity of fear, of danger, risking your life, and the unexpected every day. So I think that also probably helps for them to speak to you after resistance, that you are not, the doctor who comes or the analyst with neutrality. That was our first target in the beginning of those encounters. You are part of the history going on, the catastrophe going on, and the fight, and the resistance and the shelters. So I want to thank you for your, I would say, you could say courage, you could say brave, your experience.
Yeah, thank you very much for absolutely great thoughts. And a lot of new thoughts came to my mind with this patient. I would write it down tonight. And thank you for help, and special thank to Beatrice. She's not only teaching us, but she also shared experience being with us here. And it's for us very important too. And thank you to Oksana Lizak. She is translating today 2 hours, working very hard. Дякую, Oksana. Thank you, Jane, and thank you all. Дякую дуже.
Let me make 2 announcements.
I have a question. Beatrice is French? Beatrice.
I'm actually German origin. I live in Paris.
You live
I live in Paris, but
that's it. Okay. Hello.
You don't live very far from one another, in fact.
But yeah, I'm in Berkeley right now, so that's why I'm far from the explosion. But the explosion happened next to my house, actually. Yeah.
Nothing compared to what you lived.
No,
yeah,
absolutely
nothing.
not.
But I had exactly the same thought, that when you must have heard it, I thought Françoise must think, and the Ukrainians have to go through this every day. Unbelievable.
Yeah.
So we're thinking a lot of you, even though we only meet you once a month. And we will actually take a pause now and meet again in September. September 22nd will be our next meeting. Same time, hopefully same place. And I thank you profoundly, Oleg. But I also want to thank I saw some of the the people in the audience, Nanette Anna Auerhahn, who's joined us for the first time. It's a big honor to have you there. And also Oleksandr Fedorets, who presented a case. And so thank you really to all of you. And last but not least, we always put information in the chats, particularly for the Europeans and the non-Ukrainians, because we cannot ask you to donate, but for the non-Ukrainian Europeans and the Americans, if you want to donate some money, please to there's a European account that Bernd and Erika Toppel are managing, and then there's an American account. And if you feel like donating, it's very much appreciated.